We Were Wrong, written by Aware Material 507. Prying open a door before quickly stumbling through, I clutch at my shattered section of my carapace as I slide up against the closest wall and slump down against it with a thud. Extracting what little medical supplies I was assigned while I was still in orbit before the landing, along with whatever I was able to snag from the few corpses I'd stopped at during the retreat from one of my pouches, I quickly began tending to my wound. As I did so, I allowed my mind to do the one thing it was able to, which was running through all the events which had occurred in the last few months, while contemplating just how much High Command was wrong about the humans. Just a couple of days ago, I had just finished basic training and was swiftly assigned to the 13th Warrior Contingent, which itself was deploying alongside a dozen other of its sister regiment to a human system which had just been cleared out by one of the Grand Armadas of the Confederation. The humans were a strange bunch, determined to maintain peace in their little section of space, where they formed their own little federation with a few of their neighboring species. This small federation, despite being made up of such little territory, quickly became a regional economic power rivaling the Confederation itself. Of course, this could not stand, as only the Confederation could be allowed to maintain such an economic status, and given that the humans and their allies seemed determined to stay peaceful, High Command deemed the Human Federation to be a prime conquest, which should prove no problem for the Great Confederation military. In this notion, they were proven wrong. Despite the humans' formerly peaceful outlook and stance, the Confederation soon found full fleets of ships contesting their Grand Armadas with savage ferocity. However, no amount of resistance would make the Confederation even consider backing down now that their intentions had been made clear. And so, with fleet casualties mounting, the Confederation slowly beat the humans back into their territory. Soon enough, the Confederation armadas floated above the first of the human worlds, and swiftly following them were the finest and most elite warrior castes of the Confederation, who dropped down onto the planet to sweep clean the human menace from the face of the universe, and were met with a grinding stalemate in the form of a war of attrition, which the humans willingly threw themselves into, with thousands dying on both sides every moment. Thankfully, time was on the Confederation's side. And so, after months of grueling combat, which had hundreds of thousands of warrior castes best marching into the meat grinder in order to clog it with bodies of the fallen, the humans eventually ran out of reinforcement and supplies to slaughter the Confederation with, forcing them to surrender. It was at this point that I came into the picture, as my and my sister regiments were trained up and deployed into the next human system to be secured by the Grand Armada, which looked to have been drained of its former grandiose size. As I secured myself into the crash harness of the drop shuttle in preparation for the descent down to the ground, I listened to the speaker as the pre-recorded message from High Command played in the background, listing how the humans were nothing but weak, spineless, and undisciplined. At the time, I believed the words of High Command to a fault, as surely they would not feed us the false information. However, after a single day of deployment, I fully understood that they would, and did so in a heartbeat. Regardless, I and my broodmates eagerly prepared to destroy what I then believed were cowards and weaklings, before eventually our and hundreds of other drop pods began descending down towards the surface at mind-boggling speeds. As we entered the atmosphere, I began to grip my crash harness as the turbulence began to make itself all too clear to all my fellow warriors inside the dropship. Then the real threat made itself known as our dropship pilot pulled us into a gut-wrenching maneuver which saw a multitude of warriors in the dropship's troop compartment hurl the contents of their stomachs onto the floor, their fellow passengers, or in my case, onto themselves. I could hear a few of my fellow troopers yell out various profanities and muttered curses as we were all pulled around the compartment as the dropship began performing even more of the nauseating evasive maneuvers in order to dodge out of the way of whatever was targeting us. I myself was questioning what was happening, as certainly the humans could not have any aerial assets, as High Command had stated that the skies of the human colony were fully under Confederation control, which meant that the humans must have set up some kind of anti-aircraft batteries. Thankfully, I was one of the lucky warriors sitting close enough to the cockpit to see into the various monitors under the two pilots' purview, which included the tactical readings of all airborne objects in the general vicinity of the dropship. Stealing a glance at said console, I soon decided that I really wish I had not. As it would turn out, I was half right when I believed that the humans had set up anti-aircraft batteries, but no aerial assets. On the screen, I was able to spot dozens, no, hundreds of hostile targets on sensors, with at least 3/4 of which being anti-air missiles, shot out from who knows where. Additionally, on the terminal were the highlighted forms of fellow dropships near my own. However, to my dismay, I watched as more and more of those said dropships began being shot out of the skies, whether from strafing runs from enemy interceptors or sequential detonations from those damnable missiles. Each time another one of the dozen odd reticles of friendly blue dropships blinked out from the sensors, I knew that another 100 or so warriors were taken with them. To have such casualties, even before engaging the enemy in proper glorious battle, is shameful. Whoever allowed this to happen should be executed for incompetence. Thankfully, either thanks to the skilled flying from my dropship pilots or sheer dumb luck, my shuttle was able to make landfall. Although not at their assigned drop zone, as it was deemed no longer suitable, as even our pilots could see that it was on open slaughterhouse waiting to happen. Landing down onto the ground, I and my fellow warriors quickly rushed out of the dropships and to whatever cover they could find, as the humans were sure to have seen our shuttles descend, and as such an attack was inevitable. Despite what had happened during the trip down to the surface, I was still confident that High Command was still feeding us correct information, and so when I began hearing movement coming from a few blocks down from the dropship, I and a few of my fellow warriors began moving out towards the movement so that we may engage the puny humans in glorious combat. That notion was quickly dashed, as the furthest up warriors turned a corner before what sounded like a dozen or so human ballistic rifles opened fire, catching my fellow troops off guard with a sudden attack as well as the volume of fire which the humans shot out. High Command had stated that the humans' weapons were primitive in nature and would prove of no consequence for us warriors on the ground. However, as was becoming a reoccurring trend as of recently, those thoughts were swiftly blown away as the two warriors which the humans had surprised were swiftly dispatched as their armor was torn to pieces and shredded like those dairy products that the humans were apparently quite fond of. Jumping into as much cover as I could find, I managed to not be hit by the thunderous fire of the human squad's weapons. However, more than a few of my fellow warriors were less than lucky. As more of my fellow warriors took cover behind whatever they could find, I and a few other soldiers, who had already taken cover, began opening fire on the human squad to little effect, as the smaller bodies proved to be difficult targets as they too fell into cover and opened fire. As a few of the more melee-inclined warriors gripped their weapons and charged the human position as we provided suppressive fire, I recalled another tidbit of the High Command's report, which stated that the humans were physically weak and would crumble once we reached melee range. And again, I was proven wrong, as the humans, upon realizing what was happening, quickly affixed something to their weapons all at once before jumping out of cover and countercharging my fellow warriors as they sent a flurry of lightning-quick and exceedingly deadly strikes against a half-dozen or so warriors attacking them, all the while firing their thundering weapons everywhere, which caused many of our other warriors from firing back. With such a ferocious display unfolding right in front of me, I went against my honor, my commanding officer's instructions to hold the line and attack, and the half-year's worth of indoctrination which basic training had instilled into me, and began running like all hell was let loose. As I ran, more than a few devastating human bursts slammed into my carapace, cracking and puncturing wherever they hit. However, I did not cease in my sprint, other than to quickly snatch a satchel of medical supplies from one of the downed warriors, and now here I was, sitting down against the concrete building of human design, doped up with medical painkillers, and just barely patched up enough to not die on the spot, with something slamming the door open from outside. You know, High Command also said that the humans would torture and execute the few prisoners that they could manage to capture. God, I hope they were wrong again. End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.